Hi, and welcome to another Bible study. We are on Genesis 3, and we are looking at the Garden of Eden and the big questions of life. Because the author right here, which is put to the J tradition, which we've talked about in previous episodes, the J tradition is very concerned with answering some of the biggest questions in life, like why is life so hard? Where does evil come from? Why do humans keep screwing up? Where is God when humans screw up? And that sense also of the J tradition, speaking at a time, writing at a time of the early monarchy. And so there's an aspect here of also keeping in check that early monarchy, which we'll get to as we go through. But as we're thinking about, all right, so it's the J tradition, it's written in the early monarchy, so we're looking at the 10th to the 9th century BCE, and there's kind of some interesting things when translating at this time, just as we go through this story to keep in mind. Nahas, which is translated as snake, can also mean divination. We have Hawa, which is life giver, Eve, the mother of all who live. And then Adam, or Adam, which the name is a mixture of blood and soil. Adama, which is soil, and then dam, meaning blood. So it's kind of interesting. There's a whole lot of play on words in this particular passage and how they are interconnected in meaning, that there is a whole lot of overlap and saying these two are closer than we may think. And also in just understanding that of how does that play a part in us understanding what's kind of going on at the time. And so we can also see this in the translation in verse 6 of with her or beside her, he is Imma. And so it's kind of one of those moments where we recognize, wait a minute, Adam was right there. It seems like Adam was right there for the whole conversation with the snake. And how does that change how we understand the passage? And so there's also the word play in S, which is tree, and how the human ate from the S tree, but they gain Isaban or Eseb, pain. Pain. So that sense of how the tree and pain are interconnected. Like I said before about Genesis 2 and Genesis 1, geography-wise, we really don't have anything. Genesis 2, we at least get the Tigris and the Euphrates, but otherwise in Genesis 3, we have no idea. Archaeologically, pretty much Genesis 1 through 11, we don't have anything about. Some interesting things to note as you go through Genesis 3 is that the woman changes the prohibition slightly from what God said by adding not to touch the tree. God said to Adam, God said, do not eat of the tree. And now the woman says, okay, we're not supposed to eat and not to touch. And so it's just kind of an interesting, like, all right, this has expanded. Why did that expand? Is that how she translated it? Is that how the understanding? Then we have the snake. And so often the snake has been equated to Satan. And just to be clear, that is only in the Christian tradition, like the church tradition, that's what the snake becomes, because nowhere do we get that in Genesis 3. So to make sure that when you're reading, you're not putting things into the reading that aren't actually there. And so to recognize just the snake as the snake is. And in Near Eastern traditions, snakes are associated with death and healing, right? The venom can kill, but then anti-venom is also made from venom so that it can then heal. There's also a sense with snakes about how they shed their skins to rejuvenate themselves and that they are associated with immortality. And it's kind of interesting because that's what we're getting at in this passage, that all of a sudden immortality is not possible for humans. And then we get the snake being characterized as cunning and not wise. So the same word can be translated as wise, But that's not what the snake is here, because the knowledge that the snake uses is used to manipulate, is used to do something that is not good. And so for us to think about that, the difference between being cunning and wise. The snake also claims to know what God knows. So the snake has a bit of superiority complex in the sense of, all right, well, I know what God knows, and there's a sense here of I can take on responsibility that, or make things happen that really the snake shouldn't be doing. So the snake foretells what happens if and when, and that it asserts kind of correctly, the snake, that the man and the woman will in some fashion have become like God, in the sense of they gain the knowledge of good and evil. They don't fully become like God, where there's immortality. They lose that aspect. And that the snake carefully is manipulative to draw the woman into the conversation. And the snake raises doubts about God and what did God really say? So a few things there about the snake, and then thinking about the woman here, which is also very important to note, is that the woman sees the tree in three ways after the discussion with the snake. One is that it is good for food. Two is that it is beautiful and delightful to the eyes. And three, that it is desirable for providing intelligence. And then this conversation with God and the humans. The humans hide themselves because they've gained the knowledge of good and evil. They have lost the ability to be at ease with God. And to think about that, of how they lose the ability to be at ease with God. And the conversation also results in the blame game. Nobody wants to take responsibility for their actions. They're like, no, it's because of the snake. Oh, no, it's because of the woman. Oh, no, it's because of, like, they keep pointing instead of going, wow, we screwed up. And how do we make this right? And so part of this story is really asking us, do we have the self-reflection, the self-awareness of going, yeah, no, I shouldn't have said that. I shouldn't have done that. Do we take responsibility or do we blame? Well, I'm angry because of someone else. I did that because of. And so to recognize that when we play the blame game, we are separating ourselves from being at ease with one another, but also at ease with God. And then we get the guy's fear, the man's fear is fear of shame. And it also is being intimated within the passage that there's something even beyond the shame of being naked. That it's actually, he's now fearful of death and the guilt of the transgression. Like, he knows he has screwed up, but there's a sense of being fearful of that. And maybe we feel that. Maybe we've been embarrassed by the things that we've said or done, and maybe we're fearful of the consequences. And so it's kind of interesting what gets introduced in the ways of, this is what humans deal with. This is everything that we deal with on a constant basis. Even the whole thing about the snake enticing the woman to be kind of like God, of going, hey, doesn't that feel good? Don't you want to know? Don't you want to be like God? And we see that. We call it the God complex, right? And the J writer is dealing with the monarchy of the time of going, hey, you guys have a bit of a God complex and you guys think you are rulers of the world, and you may need to take a seat on that. You may need to go, I need to back up on that for a bit. Also, we get with this conversation the results of not only is there fear now, but the consequences. And the consequences for the snake is that the snake is now going to be forever moving upon the belly and is in perpetual humiliation and is inferior to all. And it reverses the snake's previous status, for the snake was smart and cunning, but now the snake is eating the soil, eating the dirt. And it's one of those interesting moments of going, now the snake has to eat dirt because the woman ate, and the man ate of the fruit. In another interesting note is that the task of humanity was to actually tend to the garden. And because of that, because of their transgression, because of the choices that they made, they no longer are going to be able to do that. And so they're going to have to tend outside of the garden. And so now it's going to become much more complicated. It's going to become much more painful in that sense of, why is life so painful sometimes? Why does it take so much? And for most of us, we don't live in an agricultural society. And even if we do live within an agricultural area, we may have easier means to till the soil. But to think about how difficult it would be to break the soil and create enough food. And so there is pain in that. So the consequences that we're seeing are trying to explain, okay, why is there pain in childbirth? Why is there pain in tilling the soil when we need the food from that soil to live? Why we need to birth children in the sense of, all right, so the humanity goes on, but that there's such pain in that. And so we've got the writer trying to explain, trying to help one understand the consequences and the reasons for the current state of living. In verse 21, it's kind of interesting. We get that God makes leather garments for the humans. That even though we've got God going, you can't stay in the garden. This is a consequence for your decision that you made, that I told you, you need to be careful of, that now God still is present and making leather garments so that the humans will be protected. The humans will be protected in their new environment, that God still is present with them. It looks a little bit different than it did in the garden, but God is still present, still providing, just in different ways, in ways that can be helpful if we take notice. And then we get in verse 22, we get the Lord God said that the human being has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. And this sense of, all right, well, who's us? And we talked before about in Genesis 1, some people read, oh, this must be the Trinity. You can also understand it as this is the counsel of God, especially when we get further in this, talking about the cherubims and going, all right, there are other parts of God's realm. There are angels, there are messengers, there are cherubims. And so this is more about speaking to the council. Some have interpreted it that way. And the whole thing about the cherubim actually get mentioned 90 times in the Hebrew Bible. And maybe some have identified that with the winged hybrid creatures depicted in the art of Syria and Palestine. And the role of the cherubim are to guard the boundaries of the place of divine places, such as the Garden of Eden. But they also are mentioned as protecting the temple's inner sanctum and God's chariot throne, which is Ezekiel 1 and 10. And it relates to the representation as they are awesome liminal creatures, and that in their very being, they actually mix the categories of human, animal, and God, something of God. And so it's kind of interesting that they embody like all of creation. And then I mentioned earlier, right, that the humans had been assigned to cultivate and tend to the garden. They were supposed to guard the garden, but now their task has been altered. And so now the cherubim will take over. And that this task is permanent and effective in sealing off forever the possibility of human entry. The human condition is permanently transformed in some way. And so what are some of the things that the text may be trying to convey to us? There's a difference between humans and God, immortality being one of those significant things. And that's important for us to recognize. And sometimes, like in the case of King David and King Solomon in those times, they often saw monarchs trying to act as gods and proclaiming to be gods even. David and Solomon didn't proclaim that, but sometimes they acted that way. And we see it especially during the Roman Empire, where the Caesar of the time, whoever was ruling, they actually did think of themselves as gods. And so this is saying, Genesis 3 is like, no, there is a difference between God and humans. And like I said earlier, it's also trying to explain why childbirth and cultivating the soil are just so absolutely difficult. It's also trying to talk about why snakes move differently in the world. Why are they on their belly? Why do they move in a particular way? It's also trying to explain the problems in human relationships, especially why relationships between men and women feel so unequal and unfair, why patriarchy thrives. God intended for mutuality in relationships, and that the decisions we make either separate us more and cause us far more division, or we can make decisions and take responsibility to move ourselves closer to the way we were created to be in mutuality with one another. The passage is also trying to get us to think about that God does not ordain, approve, or condone these new structural relationships, but rather that their development is part of the natural evolution begun with humanity's decision. Some have called that humanity's rebellion of God's way. They wanted to do it their own way instead of God's way. And so Eden is now turned into like this hierarchical structure that causes a lot of pain instead of the mutuality that brought the people and the animals and God together. We can think about this from a Christian perspective, that Jesus is bringing humanity back into right relationship with God and with one another. We can understand Genesis 3 to be trying to explain the decisions, actions, and that all of them have consequences. We actually know this. They can be good consequences. They can be bad consequences. They can be, it doesn't matter consequences. But everything that we do and say absolutely have consequences. And so sometimes those consequences are really severe, especially when we are in it for short-term gain. Genesis 3, they're in it for the short-term gain, and they can't project out what their decision-making might actually result in long-term. And we get Genesis 3 talking about why humans feel unsafe and vulnerable with each other. And then we have, all right, they're forced to leave the presence of God in the way of the Garden of Eden, but now the presence of God is still with them. It just feels a little bit differently, kind of like I said earlier. And we have the problem, as I have mentioned in other ways, of wanting to be like gods. And it's one of those moments of going, all right, when humans want to be like a god, or the gods, that bad things can really happen. And so you get the animals of the Garden of Eden are now needing to be used. Their skins need to be used for leather to protect the humans. And so even in that, the relationship between humans and animals has been changed. And to think about what has to lose its life when those aspire to be lords. Like even the covering of shame because they aspired to be gods, and that somebody suffers and that the animals suffer. And to think about that, we see that, right? When we have somebody with a God complex, of how there are unintended consequences, sometimes intended, but sometimes unintended, where people actually suffer because of their decisions. And then we do have something important. Like there's a whole lot of, man, this is heavy, this feels negative. But in verse 20, we can actually turn from a contemplation of pain and death to an affirmation of life, and to recognize where life is. So to understand Genesis 3 is trying to help one understand the big questions of life, of trying to get at like what are the things we are supposed to learn from these actions about ourselves and about who we want to be and about how our relationships are and what they need to be with one another and with God. So if we're looking at overall purpose, Genesis 3 is trying to explain why awful things happen in this world and why there is evil and why humans seem to be so attracted to it. This is also a warning, like I said, to the early monarchy of acting like gods, and that when they do that, it will result in pain for self and others and may even reach into other realms of creation. My hope is that as you go through Genesis 3, you'll find and ask questions of it, and you will look at it in ways that maybe it's like, that's interesting. And do we ever do any of these things like shove the blame off, don't want to take responsibility? Do we think we know it all? Do we suffer from feeling shame and guilt when in reality God has created us to be in love and not to hide from God? And so these are just some of the questions that we should be thinking through. Now, if you would like to stay, I am going to now read Genesis 3. And my hope is that you will have read it, maybe pondered it, listened to this video, and that you will read it again. So Genesis 3. The snake was the most intelligent of all the wild animals that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God really say that you shouldn't eat from any tree in the garden?" The woman said to the snake, "We may eat the fruit of the garden's trees, but not the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden. God said, 'Don't eat from it and don't touch it or you will die.'" The snake said to the woman, "You won't die. God knows that on the day you eat from it, you will see clearly and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." The woman saw that the tree was beautiful, with delicious food, and that the tree would provide wisdom. So she took some of its fruit and ate it, and also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. Then they both saw clearly and knew that they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made garments for themselves. During that day's cool evening breeze, they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden, and the man and his wife hid themselves from the Lord God in the middle of the garden's trees. The Lord God called to the man and said to him, "Where are you?" The man replied, "I heard your sound in the garden. I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself." He said, "Who told you that you were naked? Did you eat from the tree which I commanded you not to eat?" The man said, "The woman gave me some of the fruit from the tree and I ate." The Lord God said to the woman, "What have you done?" And the woman said, "The snake tricked me and I ate." The Lord God said to the snake, "Because you did this, you are the one cursed out of all the farm animals, out of all the wild animals. On your belly you will crawl, and dust you will eat every day of your life. I will put contempt between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. They will strike your head, but you will strike at their heels." To the woman he said, "I will make your pregnancy very painful. In pain you will bear children. You will desire your husband, but he will rule over you." To the man he said, "Because you listened to your wife's voice and you ate from the tree that I commanded, don't eat from it. Cursed is the fertile land because of you. In pain you will eat from it every day of your life. Weeds and thistles will grow for you, even as you eat the field's plants. By the sweat of the face you will eat bread until you return to the fertile land, since from it you were taken. You are soil, to the soil you will return." The man named his wife Eve, because she is the mother of everyone who lives. The Lord God made the man and his wife leather clothes and dressed them. The Lord God said, the human being has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. Now, so he doesn't stretch out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. The Lord God sent him out of the Garden of Eden to farm the fertile land from which he was taken. He drove out the human. To the east of the Garden of Eden, he stationed winged creatures wielding flaming swords to guard the way to the tree of life. I hope that this has been helpful this day. May you be blessed.